At 5:27 a.m. on May 12, 1967, Staff Sergeant Michael Mick Rourke knelt under the belly of an F-4C Phantom II parked on the cracked concrete of Ubon Royal Thai Air Base. The air was thick with humidity and the smell of JP-4 fuel. Dawn had barely begun to lift the gray haze over the flight line. Rourke's pilot, Captain Alan Pierce, was strapping in for his 10th combat sortie over North Vietnam. The mission briefing had been simple: two-ship escort for a strike package headed toward the rail yards outside Hanoi. Simple, but suicidal. MiG-17s and MiG-21s had been thick over the Red River for weeks, using hit-and-run slashing attacks that left Phantoms helpless in tight turns. Rourke had been maintaining F-4s for 14 months. He knew their strengths: twin J-79 engines, 36,000 pounds of thrust combined, supersonic speed, radar-guided missiles. But he also knew their weaknesses. The F-4 was a missile fighter built for intercepts, not dogfights. It lacked an internal gun, and at low speeds the hydraulics made the stick feel sluggish, especially in high-G rolling maneuvers. Pilots called it the lag. You'd move the stick, count half a heartbeat, and then the jet would respond. In a turning fight against a nimble MiG-17, that half-second was fatal. The official doctrine, "don't turn with MiGs," had become almost a joke. Every pilot knew it. Every instructor said it. But the MiGs weren't playing by the book. They were slower but infinitely more agile, turning inside Phantoms and killing them before missiles could even lock on. Rourke had watched the same pattern play out again and again. Pilots climbed into their jets full of confidence, taxied out, and didn't come back. Ubon lost 12 aircraft that spring alone. The maintenance logs always said the same thing: no mechanical fault found. Pilot error. But Rourke didn't believe in pilot error anymore. The problem, he'd realized, wasn't the men, it was the hydraulic feedback loop in the flight control system. The F-4 used a series of servo valves to transmit control stick inputs to the ailerons and stabilators. Over time, under the brutal tropical heat and constant combat sorties, a microscopic amount of air could enter the closed hydraulic line. Not enough to trigger a warning light, but enough to make the system spongy. That air bubble, smaller than a fingernail, was killing pilots. He'd reported it 3 times through maintenance channels. Each time, engineering replied with the same line: hydraulic pressure within limits. No corrective action required. Regulations forbade any field modification to the flight control hydraulics. So Rourke did what he wasn't supposed to do. He'd been a mechanic before the war, worked at a small airstrip in Kansas fixing crop dusters. He'd learned there that sometimes the manual didn't know everything. 2 weeks earlier, he'd salvaged a worn check valve from a wrecked F-105 and noticed something strange. The pilot of that jet had added a hand-filed aluminum washer behind the valve spring. It preloaded the system, tightened the response. Rourke couldn't stop thinking about it. That night, after the flight line went quiet, he stayed behind in Hangar 12. He removed the left aileron servo valve from Pierce's F-4 and cut a washer from a discarded hydraulic fitting, barely thicker than a dime. Using a pair of pliers, he filed it by hand until it matched the valve seat perfectly. The modification took 14 minutes. It added just enough preload to eliminate the sponginess in the circuit. It was illegal. It was dangerous. If it failed, the aileron could seize in flight. But Rourke had seen too many men die waiting for a system that was within limits. At 5:52, he replaced the panel, wiped his fingerprints off the access screws, and signed off the logbook as routine hydraulic inspection. No discrepancies found. Pierce never knew. When the 2 Phantoms roared off the runway minutes later, Rourke watched from the flight line, his hands black with grease, heart pounding in his chest. He had just altered a critical control component on a $2 million jet without authorization. If it failed, Pierce would crash in the jungle, and Rourke would face prison. But if it worked, maybe Pierce would live. At 7:18, over the outskirts of Hanoi, Pierce's flight was jumped by 4 MiG-17s. The lead MiG overshot and rolled into a turn. Pierce broke left to follow. Normally, the Phantom's roll response lagged just enough for the MiG to slip inside. But this time, the jet snapped into the turn like a different machine. Pierce felt it instantly. The stick responded the moment he touched it. He caught the MiG in his sight picture, fired a burst from the centerline gun pod they'd borrowed from the Navy. The tracers walked across the MiG's fuselage. The enemy plane exploded in a white flash. Pierce broke right, reversed, pulled high G. The hydraulics responded perfectly. No delay. He got a second kill 2 minutes later. When he landed back at Ubon, Rourke was waiting on the apron. Pierce climbed out, still trembling from adrenaline. "Hell of a day," he said. "Bird handled like she wanted to fight today." Rourke just nodded. Guess she had something to prove. Neither man said more. But within 48 hours, word spread through the 8th Tactical Fighter Wing that Pierce's Phantom had magic controls. Pilots whispered that somebody had figured out how to make the F-4 roll like an F-8 Crusader. Rourke said nothing. What he didn't realize yet was that within a month, half the Phantoms at Ubon would be flying with his hidden modification, and the kill ratio over Vietnam would begin to shift for the first time in years. By late May 1967, the pilots at Ubon started talking, not in briefings or reports. Those were monitored, but in the chow hall, in the dim hours after a mission, when the coffee was burned and the cigarettes never went out. They talked about Pierce's jet. Something about his F-4C, tail number 64-0812, was different. The guys called it Hot Iron 812. It rolled cleaner, steadier, faster. Pierce swore he hadn't changed a thing. But the rumors spread anyway. Captain Bill Tex Donnelly, flight lead of Red Flight, went to Rourke's maintenance bay one afternoon and asked quietly, "You're the guy who keeps 812 flying like a race car, right?" Rourke just looked up from his clipboard. "She's a good bird," he said. Donnelly leaned closer. "Then do mine." Rourke froze. For a moment he thought about lying, about saying he didn't know what the pilot meant. But he saw the same look in Donnelly's eyes that he'd seen in Pierce's that morning before takeoff. Tired, stretched, half convinced he wouldn't come back. "Bring her tonight," Rourke said. After last sortie. That night, under the dim yellow bulbs of Hangar 12, Rourke repeated the operation. He cut another washer, thinner this time, from the scrap bin of hydraulic fittings, filed it to match the servo valve seat of Donnelly's aileron control unit, reassembled the valve, and bled the line manually. The entire process took 12 minutes. He signed the log again. Hydraulic flush, routine maintenance. The next morning, Donnelly and his WSO took off for a bombing escort near Haiphong. They came back grinning like madmen. 2 MiG-21s had tried to bounce them at altitude. Donnelly pulled a defensive roll that should have been impossible for a Phantom. The MiG overshot and flew straight into the line of AIM-9s from his wingman. "Whatever you did, Sergeant," Donnelly told Rourke afterward, "don't tell me, but don't stop." Word spread faster than command could suppress it. By June 3rd, 5 aircraft in the 8th TFW had been Rourked, as pilots called it. Each time, Rourke swore it was just routine maintenance. He kept a small tin of washers hidden behind a fuel pump housing, cut from salvaged parts, each one slightly different to match the valve tolerances of individual jets. He wasn't the only one. Other crew chiefs started asking questions. Staff Sergeant Mark Jensen, who worked the next bay over, noticed the tighter roll performance on Donnelly's bird and confronted Rourke after a night shift. "You're doing something off-book," Jensen said. Rourke hesitated. Jensen had lost 2 pilots in April. Good men. Both shot down by MiGs while trying to turn. So Rourke told him, quietly, carefully, like passing along contraband. He explained the preload washer, the method, the risk. Jensen listened, nodded once, and said, "Then we're both going to prison." Within a week, Jensen had modified 3 more Phantoms. By mid-June, it wasn't just Ubon. A pilot transferred to Da Nang for a temporary rotation took the story with him. 2 weeks later, Phantoms from Da Nang began showing similar flight response. The change was spreading across bases like a secret language. Mechanics whispering, pilots testing, officers pretending not to notice. On June 23rd, Pierce scored another MiG, 17 kill northwest of Kep Airfield. The engagement was recorded on gun camera film, later analyzed by Tactical Air Command. Analysts were confused. Pierce's roll rate exceeded factory performance by nearly 15%. The engineers blamed instrument error. But the pilots knew. The kill ratios began to shift. In April, F-4s over North Vietnam averaged 1 kill for every 3 losses. By late June, it was closer to 1 for 1. In the 8th TFW, it was even better, roughly 1.3 to 1. Nothing in official upgrades could explain it. At the same time, maintenance officers started noticing discrepancies. Some hydraulic systems tested with slightly elevated preload pressure. It was still within limits, but unusually consistent across multiple aircraft. Someone was tampering with the systems, but doing it well. Major Robert Neal, the squadron maintenance officer, called Rourke into his office on June 28th. "Sergeant, I've got readings here that don't match factory spec," Neal said, pointing at a chart. "Either our gauges are lying, or someone's been inside my control systems." Rourke stood at attention. "Sir, all systems were inspected per technical order." "That's not what I asked." "Then maybe the jets are finally holding pressure like they're supposed to," Rourke said quietly. Neal stared at him for a long moment. Then he sighed, leaned back, and said, "You ever hear the saying, if it ain't broke, don't fix it? Well, Sergeant, I've lost too many men to care about paperwork. You keep my birds flying. Just don't put it in writing." That was as close to approval as Rourke was ever going to get. Through July, the mod spread through half the wing. Pilots claimed they could feel the difference instantly. No more lag, no mushy roll, no fight with the hydraulics in close combat. The F-4 still wasn't a turn fighter, but it could now reverse fast enough to survive against a MiG-17 Scissors. Enemy reports began reflecting the change. North Vietnamese pilots noted that American Phantoms were maneuvering more aggressively, even matching MiGs in rolling reversals. Old tactics, baiting the heavy jets into slow turns, stopped working. Soviet advisors were confused. They inspected wreckage from shot-down Phantoms, but found no changes in structure or control geometry. The improvement was invisible, buried inside the sealed hydraulic servo of each aircraft. On July 15th, during a massive dogfight over Thud Ridge, Donnelly's flight of 4 F-4s tangled with 8 MiG-21s. All 4 returned. 3 MiGs were confirmed destroyed, 2 probable. It was the first time in months an F-4 flight had engaged multiple MiG-21s and come home intact. That night, the pilots gathered in the dimly lit mess hall, laughing in the exhausted way only survivors could. Pierce raised a can of warm beer and said, "To the ghosts in the machine." Rourke, sitting 2 tables away, just smiled. He didn't think of himself as a hero. He thought of himself as a mechanic who was tired of signing death warrants in red ink. But his secret was starting to outgrow him. By August, Tactical Air Command in Saigon had begun to notice the trend in performance data. They sent a technical inspection team to Ubon. 3 officers in clean flight suits arrived with notebooks, asking questions about control response, maintenance routines, and hydraulic calibration. The word spread fast. Every mechanic who had done the mod was on edge. Jensen burned his stash of washers. Others loosened valves back to factory settings just in case of inspection. When the team arrived at Rourke's hangar, they spent 20 minutes checking his logbooks. Every entry was neat, every system within tolerance. The inspectors found nothing. But later that night, one of the junior officers came back alone. He found Rourke still in the hangar, wiping down a fuel pump. "I saw your name on half the birds with improved response times," the officer said quietly. "I know what that means." Rourke didn't answer. The officer hesitated, then said, "For what it's worth, keep doing it. Just don't get caught." Then he left. That was the moment Rourke realized what the war had become. Not just pilots fighting MiGs in the sky, but mechanics, sergeants, and engineers fighting bureaucracy on the ground, each one bending the rules just enough to save a life. By the end of August 1967, MiG encounters over the north had dropped noticeably. The North Vietnamese Air Force was losing aircraft at a rate it couldn't sustain. For the first time in the war, U.S. kill ratios edged toward 2 to 1. Officially, nothing had changed. Unofficially, every Phantom that mattered carried a thin, hand-filed washer in its left-wing hydraulic servo, cut from scrap metal, installed by tired hands at midnight, signed off as routine maintenance. September 1967 was wet and brutal. Monsoon rain hammered the corrugated roofs at Ubon Air Base day and night, turning the flight line into a slick gray mirror. Combat operations didn't stop for weather. Nothing did, but the downpours made maintenance hell. Rourke worked 12-hour shifts, soaked to the bone, replacing corroded connectors, sealing panels against humidity, flushing hydraulic lines. His modified washers held perfectly. Not one failure, not one seized servo. He didn't talk about it anymore. Too many people already knew. By then, the Ubon mod had spread to bases he'd never seen. Da Nang, Korat, even carriers operating off Yankee Station. No one knew exactly where it had started, only that someone had figured out how to make the Phantom feel alive. On September 23rd, Tactical Air Command sent another inspection team, this time from Wright-Patterson. For men in crisp uniforms, clipboards, and polished boots. They weren't here to ask politely. They went through hangars like auditors, taking photographs, pulling maintenance logs, cutting open hydraulic lines. Within 3 days, they found it, a faint, circular piece of hand-filed aluminum in the left aileron servo of aircraft 64-0812. Pierce's jet. The washer looked harmless, but it wasn't standard issue. The investigation froze half the maintenance wing. Rourke was summoned to the operations office on September 26th. The senior investigator, a colonel from the Air Material Command, held up the small washer inside a clear plastic bag. "Sergeant Rourke," he said, "you recognize this?" Rourke's hands were still stained with grease. "Looks like a valve shim, sir. Not one that exists in our supply system." Rourke didn't answer. The colonel studied him for a long moment. "You realize modifying flight control hydraulics without authorization violates 3 sections of the maintenance manual and at least 1 federal statute." "Yes, sir." "Then why'd you do it?" Rourke exhaled slowly. The rain outside pounded the tin roof. "Because our birds weren't responding fast enough. Because pilots were dying with everything within limits. Because someone had to fix it." The colonel said nothing for a while. Then he looked at his adjutant and said quietly, "Dismissed." That night, Rourke expected to be grounded, maybe even court-martialed. Instead, nothing happened. The inspectors stayed another week, taking samples, recording data, then flew out. No official charges. No reprimand. Just silence. But the silence meant something else was happening. In October, engineers at Wright-Patterson ran performance simulations. They recreated Rourke's modification, measuring control lag, hydraulic pressure curves, and servo response times. The results shocked them. The preload washer reduced control latency by 0.18 seconds, barely perceptible to test pilots, but decisive in a close-quarters turn fight. The engineering report concluded, the field modification provides measurable improvement in control response and should be considered for formal evaluation. The language was clinical, detached. No mention of names. No acknowledgement that the fix had been born under monsoon rain by a tired sergeant in Thailand. But the effect was immediate. In December 1967, the McDonnell Engineering Division issued an update to the F-4E design, revised servo valve preload spring seat to eliminate control lag. It was, in essence, Rourke's washer, machined, certified, and hidden behind a new part number. No one at Ubon was told officially, but the pilots could tell. The new Phantoms coming into theater that winter flew like the modified ones, tight, sharp, alive. By early 1968, the MiG kill ratios told the story no report dared to write. For every F-4 lost, nearly 3 MiGs were going down. Phantom crews once afraid to dogfight were now confident enough to challenge head-on. Rolling reversals, high-G brake turns, maneuvers that used to spell death were now part of their vocabulary. Rourke watched it happen quietly. He never bragged. He just kept fixing airplanes. Then came the Tet Offensive. In late January 1968, North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces launched attacks across South Vietnam. Air bases were hit, fuel depots burned. Ubon was spared direct assault, but the tempo skyrocketed. The flight line ran 24 hours a day. Phantoms went out loaded with bombs instead of air-to-air missiles. Rourke worked through it all. 3 weeks without a day off, sleeping under wings, eating cold rations. On February 9th, a fuel truck explosion tore through Hangar 14. Rourke was inside, bleeding a hydraulic system on an F-4D. The blast threw him across the concrete, shattering his leg. He was medevaced to Clark Air Base, then to Travis AFB in California. He spent 6 months in recovery. No one from command ever mentioned the investigation again. When he was discharged in November 1968, his record listed Vietnam service, multiple commendations, injuries sustained in line of duty. Nothing else. He went home to Wichita, Kansas, worked at a regional airport fixing light aircraft, the same way he had before the war. Married his high school sweetheart, bought a small house, raised 2 kids. He never told anyone what he'd done at Ubon, but others remembered. Captain Alan Pierce stayed in the Air Force. He flew 112 combat missions, scored for confirmed MiG kills, and survived the war. In 1975, he testified at a post-war debriefing on aircraft performance, mentioning the hydraulic feel improvement that had appeared mid-1967. It changed everything, he said. Before that, the Phantom was a brute. After that, she danced. Pierce retired as a colonel in 1980. He kept a small, battered washer on his desk, mounted in a glass case. It wasn't the original, just a reminder. The plaque beneath it read, "For those who fixed what couldn't be fixed." In 1987, a technical historian at the Air Force Museum was researching field modifications in Southeast Asia. While reviewing maintenance logs from Ubon, he noticed multiple entries signed by one name, Rourke, M.L., SSGT. The logs all used the same phrase, routine hydraulic inspection. The historian tracked Rourke down through veterans' records. Rourke was 53, still working part-time at a municipal airfield. When asked about the modification, he smiled faintly and said, "Wasn't anything special, just a washer that fit right." The historian's article, published in an aviation journal in 1990, credited an unnamed U.S. Air Force mechanic in Thailand with a control improvement that likely saved dozens of pilots. No official recognition followed. There were no medals for unauthorized innovation. But inside the engineering annex at Wright-Patterson, in a binder labeled Field Observations, Vietnam Era, there's a note appended to the servo valve documentation. Original field concept identified by maintenance personnel, 8th Tactical Fighter Wing, Ubon 1967. Improvement verified through flight testing. Integrated into subsequent production models. That's as close to immortality as most mechanics ever get. Rourke died in 2004, age 65. His obituary in the Wichita Eagle listed him as aircraft mechanic, U.S. Air Force veteran, loving husband and father. Nothing about secret modifications, nothing about MiG kills or engineering breakthroughs. But at the Air Museum in Topeka, among the dusty exhibits about the F-4 Phantom, there's a small display case marked Field Innovation, Vietnam, 1967. Inside, behind the glass, sits a hand-filed aluminum washer no bigger than a coin. The label reads, "Unofficial component, origin uncertain." Believed to have improved control response on early F-4 Phantoms. Typical of countless unauthorized modifications that shaped air combat during the Vietnam War. Visitors walk past it without noticing. Kids press their faces to the glass to see the big jet photographs, not the dull gray ring of metal at the bottom. But the curators know what it means. Pilots know. Mechanics know. Wars are fought by generals and remembered by historians. But they are won by the people who fix things when no one is looking. Somewhere, deep in a stack of faded maintenance logs, there's a line signed by a tired hand in pencil. Routine hydraulic inspection, no discrepancies found. That's where the story really lives.